The wind howled across the Alaskan tundra, a relentless force that stripped warmth from everything it touched. Luna trudged through the white wasteland, her massive paws sinking into the deep snow with each labored step. Her breath emerged in heavy clouds, dissipating into the icy air while her two cubs struggled to keep up. The storm was fierce, a tempest of swirling snow that turned the world into a blur of white, and Luna's ears twitched at the sound of branches snapping somewhere. In the distance, she paused, sniffing the air for any sign of danger or hope, her black nose twitching as she filtered the storm's bitter scent for anything familiar. Her cubs huddled close to her flank, their fur dusted with frost. The younger one stumbled, letting out a soft whimper, but Luna nudged it forward, her maternal instincts overriding her exhaustion. Shelter. That was all she needed. A place where the wind couldn't reach them, where she could guard her cubs until the storm passed. But the land offered no mercy, only the endless white and the jagged outlines of skeletal trees swaying in the gale. Her eyes, sharp and amber, scanned the horizon, and then she saw it, a faint light flickering through the snow, barely visible but undeniable. Her body tensed as she considered the source. Human. She had smelled them before, seen their marks on the land, but the storm gave her no choice. She turned toward the light. Inside a sturdy log cabin, Sam adjusted his chair to sit closer to the wood stove, the steady crackle of burning logs a comforting counterpoint to the storm outside. The window pane trembled against the wind, and frost crept along its edges, framing his view of the chaos beyond. He sipped his coffee, his calloused hands cradling the warm ceramic mug. Across the room, Martha stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered into the storm. "See anything out there?" Sam asked, his voice gruff but steady. Martha shook her head, her short grey hair catching the firelight. "Nothing. But snow. It's a bad one," Sam grunted. "Haven't seen it come down like this in years. Could last all night." Martha didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the blizzard, scanning the shifting shapes and shadows outside. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a dark shape moving against the storm. She blinked, pressing her face closer to the glass. There it was again, closer this time. Two shapes, no, three, weaving through the snow. She gasped softly. "Sam," she whispered, "there's something out there." Sam set his mug down with a thud and rose from his chair, his boots scuffing against the hardwood floor. He joined her at the window, squinting into the swirling snow. At first, he saw nothing but the storm's white fury, but then he caught it, a fleeting glimpse of movement, something large and deliberate. His jaw tightened. "Bear," he muttered. "Looks like a sow with cubs." Martha's eyes widened. "Out in this storm, they'll never survive." Sam sighed, his brow furrowing as he watched the figures struggle against the wind. "Not our problem," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He stepped away from the window and returned to the fire, grabbing a log to stoke the flames. "They're wild animals. They know how to handle the cold." "Not in this," Martha said, her tone sharp. She turned from the window, her hands on her hips. "They're desperate, Sam. You can see it." Sam shook his head, his movements slow and deliberate as he set the log on the fire. "And what do you want me to do about it? Invite them in for tea?" His attempt at humor fell flat, and Martha's expression didn't waver. He sighed again, rubbing a hand over his face. "They're dangerous, Martha. You know that." "So is this storm," she countered. "And they're not just bears. She's a mother, Sam. You can see it in the way she moves, how she's protecting her cubs." Sam didn't respond. The crackling fire filled the silence between them, its warmth a sharp contrast to the storm's icy rage. Outside, the shapes drew closer, the mother bear leading her cubs through the blizzard. Sam and Martha stood in tense stillness, each weighing what the next hours might hold. Finally, Martha spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "We can't just sit here and do nothing." Sam met her gaze, his eyes shadowed with the weight of a decision he didn't want to make. Outside, the blizzard raged on, and the shadows in the snow pressed closer to the fragile glow of the cabin's light. The storm showed no sign of letting up, its fury battering the cabin like a living force determined to snuff out the fragile warmth within. Sam and Martha sat in silence, the fire crackling steadily as they both stared into the flames, lost in their thoughts. Outside, the bears lingered near the cabin, the cubs now curled tightly against their mother's side, their small bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. Martha broke the silence first, her voice low. "They'll freeze out there." Sam didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the fire. "They've been through worse, I'm sure." "You don't know that," Martha said softly, leaning forward. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers twisting nervously. "Look at her, Sam. She's not moving because she doesn't have the strength. Those cubs won't last the night." Sam sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The lines there seemed deeper now, carved by years of hard decisions and the weight of a life lived close to the unforgiving wilderness. "And what happens if we let them in? You think she's just going to curl up by the fire like a dog?" "She's a bear, Martha, wild and unpredictable. She's a mother," Martha countered, her voice sharper now. "And she's doing everything she can to protect her children. You of all people should understand that." Sam flinched at her words, though she hadn't meant them to cut so deeply. He turned his head toward the window, the frost-covered glass, obscuring the view of the bears. His thoughts drifted to his own memories, days spent tracking through these same woods, rifle in hand, back when he believed survival meant taking from the land without question. The image of a bear he had once felled flashed in his mind, unbidden. He remembered its eyes, wide with fear and pain, and the cub that had wandered into view moments too late, mewling softly at its fallen mother. He cleared his throat, pushing the memory away. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking," Martha said, standing now, her arms crossed. "I'm asking you to show that you've changed, that you're not the man who used to see these animals as trophies or threats, that you're the man I know you've become." Sam closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him like the snow piling up outside. When he opened them again, he saw Martha watching him, her expression a mixture of determination and quiet hope. He cursed under his breath and stood. "Fine," he muttered, "but we're doing this my way." The cabin door creaked open, and the storm's icy breath spilled inside. Luna lifted her head at the sound, her ears swiveling toward the noise. She rose slowly, her powerful body casting a shadow against the snow, and growled low in her throat as the human figure emerged once. Again. This time he carried no food, only his own presence, steady and unthreatening. Sam stopped several paces away, his voice low and firm. "Come on then. If you're going to trust us, you'd better do it now." Martha appeared in the doorway behind him, holding a thick blanket. She stayed back, her posture relaxed but watchful. Luna stared at the humans, her amber eyes flickering, with a mixture of caution and something else, understanding perhaps, or desperation born of the storm's unyielding cruelty. Her cubs stirred, one letting out a plaintive cry as it poured at her side. Luna made her decision. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate, each step calculated as though the ground itself might betray her. The cubs followed hesitantly, clinging to their mother's heels. Sam remained still, his hand resting lightly on the cabin doorframe as he waited. When Luna reached the threshold, she paused, her massive head lowering as she sniffed the air, her breath misting in the cold. Sam didn't move. "It's all right," Martha whispered from behind him. "She knows we won't hurt her." Luna stepped inside. The warmth of the fire hit her first, melting the frost that clung to her fur. The cubs followed quickly, their small forms darting past her legs to explore the unfamiliar space. Sam closed the door carefully, locking the storm out behind them. The room seemed to shrink with Luna's presence, her size and power undeniable in the confined space. She sniffed the air again, her muscles tense, but she didn't growl or bare her teeth. Instead, she moved toward the farthest corner, where the cubs had already settled into a pile of blankets Martha had left for them. The tension in the room was palpable. Sam and Martha stood by the fire, watching the bears with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Luna lay down slowly, curling her body protectively around her cubs, who were already dozing off, their small chests rising and falling in unison. Sam exhaled, the sound heavy with both relief and disbelief. "This is insane," he muttered. Martha smiled faintly, her eyes shining. "Maybe, but it's the right thing." For a long time neither of them moved. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin a fragile peace settled over them. The fire crackled, casting warm light over the unlikely group huddled together against the cold. The storm roared on through the night, its icy fingers clawing at the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dim light. Sam sat in his chair, his rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach. He wasn't foolish enough to let his guard down, but there was something almost surreal about the sight before him. A mother bear curled protectively around her cubs, her massive body rising and falling with each steady breath. Martha moved quietly, placing another log on the fire. She glanced at the bears, her expression soft. "They're just sleeping," she whispered, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm. Sam grunted in acknowledgement but said nothing. His eyes remained on Luna, her fur glistening faintly in the firelight where the frost had melted away. She seemed smaller now, her power subdued by exhaustion and the warmth of the cabin. Yet Sam knew better than to underestimate her. The wild wasn't something you tamed, it was something you respected. Martha settled into the chair across from him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said, her voice low. "Having them here, it feels natural almost." Natural? Sam gave her a skeptical look. "A bear in the house?" "Sure, that's just how we imagined retirement." Martha smiled, faintly, though her eyes remained fixed on the cubs. "I meant it feels right, like they belong here just for tonight." Sam leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him. "You're an optimist, Martha. Always have been. I'll give you that." "Maybe," she admitted, "but look at them, Sam. They're no different than us, really, just trying to get through the storm one way or another." Sam's gaze softened, though he wouldn't say it aloud. He could see it too, the raw determination in Luna's every movement, the fierce love that drove her to protect her cubs at all costs. It reminded him of the lengths he and Martha had gone to in the early years, scraping by in this harsh land, learning to rely on each other when everything else seemed set against them. The minutes stretched into hours, the storm outside a steady drumbeat against the roof. Luna stirred occasionally, her ears flicking at the sound of wind and snow, but she remained where she was, her body a shield against the night's cold. The cubs slept soundly, their tiny snores barely audible over the crackling fire. Sam finally broke the silence. "You realize we're taking a hell of a risk." Martha looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes risks are worth it. And sometimes they get you killed," he said, his voice heavy. "You think she's grateful? She's here because she's desperate. If she thought for a second we were a threat, she'd tear us apart." "But we're not a threat," Martha said firmly, "and she knows it. You can see it in the way she looks at us." "She's smart, Sam. Smarter than you're giving her credit for." Sam rubbed his temples, shaking his head. "I just don't want you to think this is some kind of fairy tale. She's still a bear, Martha." Martha reached over and placed a hand on his knee, her touch warm and steady. "I know what she is, and I know what we are too. We're all just trying to survive." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind's relentless howl. Sam nodded finally, though he still looked uneasy. He leaned forward, poking at the fire to coax the flames higher, as if the act might drive away the storm and the doubts lingering in his mind. Suddenly, a soft whimper broke the quiet. One of the cubs stirred, its tiny body shifting against the blankets. Luna's head lifted immediately, her amber eyes snapping open, alert and watchful. She sniffed the air, her gaze darting to the humans before settling on her cub. She made a low, rumbling noise, almost like a purr, and the cub quieted, nestling closer to her side. Martha smiled. "She's so gentle with them." Sam glanced. At the scene, his jaw tightening. "Gentle until she's not." "Sam," Martha said softly, her tone almost pleading. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. I know. I just don't want us to regret this." Martha didn't reply, but the look in her eyes said everything. This wasn't a decision to be regretted, it was one to be lived with, no matter the outcome. The hours dragged on, the storm's fury never waning. Sam and Martha took turns keeping watch. Though Luna showed no signs of aggression, she remained in her corner, her body a quiet sentinel over her sleeping cubs. By the time dawn's first light began to filter through the frost-covered windows, the cabin felt different, as though the storm had shifted something deeper than the snow. When Sam opened the door to check the weather, the storm had finally subsided. The sky was a pale, icy blue, the sun rising weakly over the snow-blanketed wilderness. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in the frigid air, before turning. "Back inside. They'll be able to leave soon," he said, his voice gruff. "Weather's clear enough." Martha joined him, her gaze drifting to the bears. Luna was awake now, her eyes sharp and alert as she watched the humans. There was no fear in her expression, only a quiet understanding. "Maybe it's time for all of us to move on," Martha said, her voice tinged with both sadness and hope. Sam nodded, though his throat felt tight. "Maybe." The morning light spilled through the cabin's frosted windows, casting a soft golden glow over the room. Outside, the snow glistened like a blanket of diamonds, the storm's fury replaced by a serene stillness. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken understanding, a fragile truce between humans and nature. Luna stretched her massive body, her movements slow and deliberate. The cubs stirred, letting out soft, squeaky sounds as they yawned and nuzzled closer to their mother. She watched them for a moment, before shifting her gaze towards Sam and Martha. Her amber eyes held a quiet intensity, and for a brief instant, it seemed as if she was weighing them in her mind. Martha broke the silence first. She stood from her chair and moved toward the kitchen, her steps light and deliberate. Sam watched her with narrowed eyes. "What are you doing now?" he asked, his voice gruff but laced with curiosity. Martha glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Making breakfast. They'll need their strength before they head out." Sam sighed and shook his head, muttering something about how she was spoiling the bears now, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned his attention back to Luna, who remained still but alert, her body tense with the instinct to protect her cubs. The aroma of cooking oatmeal filled the cabin, mingling with the lingering scent of wood smoke. Martha worked quickly, ladling the steaming porridge into a shallow metal pan. She let it cool for a moment before placing it on the floor near the bears, careful not to come too close. "There," she said softly, stepping back. "Something warm for the road." Luna sniffed the air, her ears twitching. She eyed the offering warily, her muscles coiled as though ready to spring at the first sign of danger. But when Martha retreated to her chair and sat down, Luna finally moved. She lowered her head to the pan, sniffed it cautiously, and then began to eat. The cubs followed suit, their tiny faces burying into the warm meal with enthusiasm. Sam watched the scene in silence, his expression unreadable. When Luna finished, she licked her muzzle and turned her attention back to the humans. There was no aggression in her posture now, only an almost imperceptible shift in her demeanor, as though she understood that their time together was coming. "To an end! They're ready," Sam said after a long moment. He stood and moved to the door, pulling it open to reveal the glittering expanse of snow outside. The wind had calmed to a whisper, and the trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with frost. Martha joined him, her hands clasped together. "Do you think they'll be all right out there?" Sam looked at her, his eyes softening. "She's got this far, hasn't she? She'll make it." Luna seemed to sense the change. She rose to her full height, towering over the humans, but there was no menace in her movements. She nudged her cubs gently, urging them to their feet. The cubs hesitated for a moment, their small faces turning toward the warmth of the fire. But Luna gave a low, insistent growl, and they obeyed. The bears moved toward the open door, their dark forms silhouetted against the brightness outside. Luna paused at the threshold, her head turning back toward the couple. For a moment she held their gaze, her amber eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire behind them. It wasn't gratitude in the human sense, but there was something profound in her expression, an acknowledgement perhaps of the bond they had shared, however briefly, and then she was gone, stepping into the snow with her cubs close behind. The trio moved with purpose, their tracks carving a path through the pristine landscape. Sam and Martha stood in the doorway, watching until the bears disappeared into the trees, their dark shapes swallowed by the endless white. Martha exhaled, softly, her breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. "Do you think she'll remember us?" Sam shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't really matter." Martha looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "It matters to me." Sam finally turned to her, his lips quirking into a faint smile. "Yeah, I figured it would." They stepped back inside, closing the door against the chill. The cabin felt larger now, emptier somehow, though the fire still crackled warmly in the hearth. Sam settled into his chair, and Martha began tidying up, her movements slow and deliberate. "Storm's passed," Sam said after a while, his voice breaking the quiet. "We should check the traps later. Make sure we've got enough for the next few weeks." Martha nodded, but her thoughts seemed elsewhere. She glanced at the window, the frost beginning to melt in the morning sun. "It's strange," she murmured, "how something so wild can feel so familiar." Sam didn't reply, but his gaze softened. He understood what she meant, even if he wouldn't admit it. The bears had left their mark, not just in the faint warmth of their bodies that still lingered in the air, but in the way they had challenged the couple to confront their own fears, their own humanity. Outside, the wilderness stretched on, vast and untamed, and somewhere in the distance, Luna and her cubs moved forward, their tracks fading beneath the ever-falling snow.